Thank you very much for joining us today for what I expect to be a lively debate. I'm Paul Saunders, President of the National Interest. We're very pleased to have all of you with us. I guess we will start with Jacob Heilbrunn, who will speak for what he thinks 6-8 minutes. Then we will turn to Curt Mills. After the two of them finish, I will ask a question to each, and then we'll open it up to questions from the floor. So first, my colleague Jacob, who of course is editor of the National Interest, author of the new book, America Last, and previously of the book They Knew They Were Right, about the neoconservatives, and a long-time journalist. Jacob.
Thank you, Paul. And I would like to thank all of you for coming today, as well as Curt, who I feel obligated to note I hired at the National Interest a number of years ago. He passed our ideological litmus test at the time and has ascended since then to greater heights. He is now editor of the American Conservative and had a provocative piece in the New York Times yesterday that I would urge all of you to read, explaining why, far from being an international menace, Donald Trump will be a peacemaker in the Nixonian mold should he be elected to office for another term. My views on Trump obviously differ, and actually I have an op-ed coming out in the New York Times that will be a response to, in some ways, to Curt's. And my views differ because I see Trump as not promulgating new arguments on the right, but actually restoring older ones from the past. And one of the most telling remarks that Trump made, and that I think shows his consistency in foreign policy thought, I think Trump is underestimated. He's often depicted as a toddler-in-chief, impetuous, capricious when it comes to international relations. I actually believe that he does have consistent and predictable views. And one of the most telling instances where he enunciated them came in March 1990 in a magazine that dealt with affairs, but not foreign affairs, called Playboy, in which Trump expounded upon his belief. Remember, this is in 1990. He said that Mikhail Gorbachev, the leader of the Soviet Union, had bungled it. He said, not a firm enough hand. Instead of rejoicing in the collapse of the Soviet Union, Trump saw it as a net negative. Who did he then go on to praise? A few sentences later, he said, you know, the dictators in China, the Communist Party there, they responded appropriately to Tiananmen Square. He said they were vicious, they were horrible, but they showed strength. And that, to me, is in a way the essence of Trump's affinity for authoritarianism. In my book, I try to show that there has been a faction on the right and within, more or less within the Republican Party, that has consistently espoused an affinity for authoritarianism. And I trace it back. I begin in World War I, when there were, you couldn't really call it conservatism, but you could call it a nascent right. I look at one figure named George Sylvester Viereck, who was actually a paid agent of the German government in both World War I and World War II. I look at H.L. Mencken, and I look at Albert J. Nock, who was a mentor to William F. Buckley. And all of them espoused revisionism about World War I, which arguing that in fact Germany, that Prussian autocracy had been superior to the Western democracies, and that Germany had been encircled by the Western powers. So a lot of my book focuses on revisionism, which I think emerged during and after World War I and came into full flower in the 1930s with the rise of the America First movement. And there I look at a variety of figures who may look obscure today, but were in fact prominent at the time, not just including Charles Lindbergh, but a variety of other figures that I talk about, including Elizabeth Dilling, who spoke widely in the United States and was known as the female Führer in Germany. And I look at the avidity for Mussolini and Hitler in the 1930s. And one of the arguments in my book is that much as the fellow travelers in the United States looked towards communist regimes as models for the United States, the right, in fact, was doing the same thing, arguing that Mussolini and Hitler had hit upon superior methods of governance that should be emulated in the United States. Another hero at the time for many Catholics was Francisco Franco. And so I also look at an industrialist in New York named Merwin K. Hart, who was very active in right-wing circles, was anti-Semitic, was also very close to William F. Buckley. I trace then on the right, even though we went into World War II and the America First movement collapsed, I talk about how revisionism lingered on this time towards Nazi Germany. And I look specifically at Regnery Press and what we would call nascent Holocaust denial, arguing that Regnery published books arguing that the United States had perpetrated war crimes against Nazi Germany that were similar or worse than anything the Nazis had done. And I look at Joseph McCarthy, who picked up on this, and there was a well-known trial of Nazi soldiers and SS men who had murdered American soldiers at Malmedy at the Battle of the Bulge in 1944. These soldiers had surrendered. About 100 Nazis were tried after World War II. They were found guilty, sentenced. McCarthy picked up on the allegation that this was Jewish lawyers in the War Department who had hounded innocent Nazis, and this became a flap in the United States, and it was a precursor to his attacks on his anti-communist attacks, including on what then the War Department became the Defense Department. I trace this through World War II, how the veneration for dictators continued to exist, including among William F. Buckley towards South Africa and apartheid, and weave that in with Buckley's hostility to the civil rights movement in the United States. And then I take it up to today, and I'm giving you a Cliff's Notes version here. Then I take it up to today and talk about the rise of Patrick Buchanan, the battles within the Republican Party over what constitutes true conservatism. And of course, I argue that Buchanan in some ways represents a more authentic tradition in the Republican Party than the one that was grafted onto it by their enemy, the neoconservatives. And I argue, I assign culpability for the rise of Trump in some measure also to the neoconservatives into the second Iraq War, which interestingly, I think they still don't, many of them don't continue to accept. I was looking at Bob Kagan's new book last night on the rise of what he considers anti-liberalism. And he never mentions, for example, the Iraq War or neoconservatism in the book. So I could be accused of teleology here. That's something I'm surprised no one in the reviews has done, which is reading the history backwards. But I do think that Trump represents a coherent and dangerous continuity with this faction or movement. I don't consider it to embody foreign policy realism, because I think it will result in a diminution of American standing, power, and influence abroad. And with that, I think I'll hand it over to Curt for his riposte.
Thank you, Jacob. We're very pleased to have Curt Mills here. Jacob mentioned, of course, that Curt was a former colleague at the National Interest. Went on to write for U.S. News and World Report as a reporter there, and most recently, earlier this year, appointed editor of the American Conservative. And we're always here at the center very pleased to see our colleagues do well, and our former colleagues do well. So congratulations, Curt, and welcome. Look forward to your response.
Excellent. Thank you for the invitation and the audience. So I will just respond extemporaneously to my friend's sermon here. Colorful and encyclopedic, as always, but I would submit that Jacob's analysis is likely not to be predictive, and I believe it has elements that are rankly inconsistent. So first, he uses the term menace. So I think we should all be for Trump. I'm going to anchor my comments on Trump. I know the subject is the authoritarianism and the American right. My piece, as mentioned, was on Trump, and that is just what we are doomed to talk about between now and November, and perhaps forevermore. So the idea that he's a menace, I think we should just take that off the table right quick. If we believe that we are a democracy here in the United States, it is very clear that there is an appetite for what the man is selling. There is an appetite for him to be nominated by the second oldest party in the United States, I think 3 straight times. There is an appetite for him to be on the ballot, even amidst unprecedented legal exposure. If he's a menace, that is a Washington consensus. It is not an American consensus. To the question of the past, so I will not respond to specific examples. I will respond to the one that I thought was most evocative in Jacob's book, which was the relationship, admiration expressed by H.L. Mencken, Lord of Baltimore, for the Kaiser. I do, again, here think this is a bit of misdirection. It is totally possible H.L. Mencken, while filing innumerable columns, said nice things about the former autocratic leader of Germany. But again, I would submit, does Jacob believe that the First World War was justly fought and in American interest to get involved, or really anybody's interest? This is interesting stuff. He's a columnist. He's very colorful. That's why people read him. That's why people remember him. But I'm not getting the recommendations. I'm not getting the what is actually useful here, other than to tar and feather this figure from now over 100 years ago. As to Mr. Trump's former comments to the Playboy magazine, I would also circle a example from this era. I think Jacob is implicitly conceding that Trump does have an ideology, which I think is the sort of central canard of our time. The idea that this guy has no thoughts, he's a complete nihilist on wheels, he's just making it up. I do believe he has an ideology. I would point back to an interview that he did with Oprah Winfrey a few years before that, where he said virtually all the same things that he's saying now, which is, this is also very interesting because that's the heyday or near it of the Reagan administration, and he was not speaking positively of American standing in the late 80s. He said we were getting ripped off by trade. He was sort of a Japan doomer, to use the colloquial term back then. He thought, Japan would run the country by the 90s, perhaps now it's China. I think that's of a piece. As to the comment about the behavior of the Chinese authorities or the Russians lack of follow through at the end of the Cold War. I'll link it to something that's happened more recently. Trump's appraisal of Putin's behavior in the last 27 months of the war. He has praised Putin for being a killer, for going in, and then of course immediately sort of pivoted as the war proved an elective disaster for the Russians, at least in the first year. I also think this is like fun and colorful and good journalism, but Trump often very much handicaps like rival golfers, right? Just because he says that he thinks Putin's got a cool drive doesn't mean he's going to let him roll over him on the course. And again, I think the key here is this is all really fun and it's good for our industry, but we have this whole problem with this type of analysis called the first term of the Trump administration, where we have a record here. And so if we're just actually analyzing beyond all of the allegations of compromise, beyond all of the noise, behind everything that everybody in this room knows about, policy of the Trump administration, 2017 to 2021, was net more hawkish and escalatory towards the Russian state than his predecessor, Barack Obama. Obama did not give the Ukrainian government javelins. Trump did. And again, I think just to attack a little bit more this idea that Trump he's really going to do the dictatorship thing this time. It's a little bit like, to pick on, I guess, my own side, it's a little bit like the Republican argument, like, wow, Biden is senile and he's just not going to make it. Yet he keeps, winning elections. He overperformed in the midterms, and I think he is the most competitive possible Democrat on the ballot in November. They're not going to replace him in the convention. I'm pretty high conviction on it. But it's a great column space to say, what if they might? As to the criticism of right having admiration for foreign models of government as potential replica or potential model for American domestic governance. Okay, so you cited Mussolini. I'm not aware of exactly who you're citing for that thought a Third Reich should be established in the United States other than like the actual American Nazi Party. Mussolini, if that's going to be a guilt by association admiration, i.e. what Mussolini was doing in the 20s and early 30s, then I think you have to go equally, if not more so, against the Roosevelt administration, which openly admired a lot of what the Duce was doing, and they were actually in charge of the state. As to the comment about nascent denial of the Shoah, I don't think Trump has ever done that publicly, and I don't think that merits a response. As to the comments on apartheid and the South African state in the 80s, Jacob, I believe, has publicly fashioned himself a Cold War liberal. So I would humbly ask, which is it? Because I believe that U.S. realpolitik in South Africa was a staple of Cold War liberalism and a staple of fighting the Cold War full froth. And then I would also submit, as I believe he has said elsewhere publicly, if you believe that the Putin-led state is the greatest American menace, or menace to American interests, then I would note that the government in Moscow continues to have a relationship with the African National Congress, which, unless that changes later this month in the election, is a basic reality for the last half century in South African politics. And finally, I have no objection to the idea that the ideology and framework of Patrick J. Buchanan is a far more natural fit to the Republican Party and Republican voters in this country. TAC was founded by Pat, and I think this is long overdue. Thank you.
Did not disappoint when I predicted that we would have a lively exchange. So thank you very much, Curt and Jacob. I'm going to ask each of them a question here to get us rolling. And I guess, Jacob, my question to you would be, looking at Donald Trump and what he says about foreign leaders, how seriously do you take it? I think one could take a position that, he's trying to negotiate. He wanted to negotiate with Kim, he wanted to negotiate with Putin, he wanted to negotiate with Xi. So he kind of said a lot of nice things about each of them, even as he was perhaps trying to position himself, certainly in government, in a tough way in other respects. There's going to be fire and fury, but Kim Jong-un is a great guy, right? So how seriously do you take those statements that you talk about? Trump kind of admiring this person or that person.
I mean, the encomiums seem to be reserved for these dictators. And particularly in the case of Putin, if you think back to Helsinki, for example, I don't think that Trump cut a very prepossessing figure. Quite the contrary, he emerged like a cringing dog out of their mutual conference together, and we still don't know what was said between the two men. With Kim Jong-un, Trump, yes, did do the fire and fury, then he said they fell in love. He'd extracted nothing from North Korea. He gave it all up. He traveled there, but, they haven't slowed any of their missile designs or their pursuit of military dominance. There's no sign that these statements of his actually produced anything. And Curt was referring to the first term. And he sort of opened a trapdoor on himself there, if I may say so, because it is blindingly obvious to anyone that Trump felt constrained and hampered by his establishment neo-Reaganite advisors during his first term. And look, in his Time interview a few weeks ago, he said that he felt betrayed by them, and he expressly signaled that he has no intention of duplicating the first term. And all signs and portents are that, which should come as good news to you, Curt, that he will appoint rabid ideologues for the second term.
That's a little extreme. Curt, let me ask you a question. We wrote in the New York Times kind of comparing former President Trump to former President Nixon. And you were, in that piece, kind of suggesting that Trump might have some favorable things in common with Nixon. Do they share any weaknesses? This is, of course, the Center for the National Interest, founded, by Richard Nixon, and certainly, I think many of the people looked to Nixon and Henry Kissinger and others as important thinkers on foreign policy, but Nixon had a dark side.
Right. Well, you're not going to trap me into saying that I think Donald Trump has no weaknesses as a human being. He does. I just think the analogy is perhaps most useful in that their strengths are similar, and obviously that these are and were radically different personalities. I think it's fairly clear that Nixon was more introverted than Trump. I think it's fairly clear that Nixon came from a lot rougher circumstances. I think it's established that Nixon worked his way up through American politics, this sort of self-made man as politician almost, and that's not true of Trump at all. I think what you are gesturing towards, but didn't directly ask, is Trump a paranoid wreck, like the former president, Nixon, and that will be his undoing. I don't see it. I think what's more useful is the idea that I think is emerging on the right, the idea that what exactly was Watergate again, and why did he leave, and was that all good, and should we have an unelected bureaucracy in this country that can run people out of town? And I think these are all worthwhile questions to ask, and not just the provence of rabid ideologues, as my friend postulates.
All right. We have a lot to talk about here. I'll open it up for questions. When I recognize you, please identify yourself here.
Yes, I'm Michael Blakos, and Americans have always inhabited a moral universe that is binary, black and white, good or evil, either or, light and darkness, and therefore it becomes a stock in trade of political rhetoric to shape Philippic missiles at the other side, claiming that they have fallen into a moral abyss. And if you look at the broader landscape, however, of American history, going back to Jefferson and Hamilton and events like the Citizen Genet affair, and you can go all through our history, there's always been a swing on both sides between a focus on order and control and a looser, more relaxed approach. Whether you want to call that liberalism or illiberalism is, again, part of that whole rhetorical sling and arrow approach. And so I see a lot of synchronization, self-synchronization and convergence with other countries right now as the apparatus of human control becomes more and more powerful and refined. And so there is, I would argue, convergence going on right now between China and the United States in terms of the focus on order. And with the contractonist society, there is a broad support for that order. It's just a question of who will be advantaged by that order. So I think the populist versus elitist lens may be more applicable here, rather than taking the extremely exciting approach of personification and demonization. So just like your thoughts about these larger currents as opposed to the very narrow cult of personality approach that you've taken. This time, Jacob first.
So you're postulating, to be clear, that Trump is part of a worldwide phenomenon towards
We have different currents. You have a pendulum swing, which now you can see among the people is toward reestablishing order in a disordered American society, and that's the power of the populism. And then you see a control orientation, frankly, on the part of blue, to advantage themselves and to control the populists, which is why you have such an anti-populist focus. And I think that has been a leitmotif throughout American history.
I mean, look, Professor Blais, I'm less immersed in these terms than you, but I mean, I think the words order and chaos are definitely watchwords. I had to shout more. Okay, I'm less versed in those specific terms than you, but I believe the terms order and chaos are very much watchwords of this moment. Whatever you think of him, one of the most popular philosophers, if not the most popular philosopher alive, is, at least in the English language, is Jordan Peterson. His books sell millions of copies, often to sort of lost young men. And I believe the subhead of his book is An Antidote to Chaos. And so there is this idea that the existing framework is not working for a lot of people, and that framework is producing an element that we might call chaos. I think I would only slightly caveat that I think this stuff makes for good think pieces, but I think what's going on in China and Russia specifically, since these are the examples that have been cited, are probably very distinct from the United States. China and Russia have been more dangerous, more violent countries for all of modern history. And so while there may be similarities, I believe they are overwhelmed by differences.
Well, I do not swirl around in the academic circles that you do, Michael. So this may be I see it a little differently than you do. I think that in a time there are periods of upheaval in American history, and we're in one right now. And my view is that Trump has astutely and effectively tapped into older currents that have existed in the 1920s when you had the rise of the eugenics movement. You had the 1924 Anti-Immigration Act, which essentially cut off most immigration, particularly from Eastern and Southern Europe. You had the retreat from internationalism or nascent internationalism. So I think, again, for me, Trump does not represent anything new. I don't hear any new arguments, any new insights. I think he's an effective demagogue.
But how about the pendulum swing idea? Because in many ways, what happened after World War I was a swinging of the pendulum, and then it swung.
It did out of, which is not inconsistent with the Second Iraq War, because World War I had been sold as a battle for freedom, the war to end wars, democracy, and you end up with the Treaty of Versailles, which even Wilson's own liberal followers were disillusioned. So, yes, there does seem to be a certain circularity to American history.
All right, I think here, then Harry.
Thank you. Ariel Cohen, the Atlantic Council. If you look at Donald Trump as some suggested here, a populist, somebody who's tapping in the pre-World War II tradition of the Republican Party, but also a man with visceral political instincts. We all can agree that, with all this legal stuff that's going on, to poll as effectively as he does, you have to have something as a politician. What would be his response in the second term to three major clusters, if you wish? One domestic, one global, and the last one also domestic. First one, what, for the lack of better term, we describe as woke ideology, woke uprising. And I'm not only talking about campuses in Gaza, I'm talking about what was going on, how this ideological thing on the left is shifting in front of our eyes and gaining more power. What will be his response? Two, the fast evolution of tech, AI, genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, et cetera, and finally, if, God forbid, the balloon goes up, either with China or in Europe, what would be his qualities of a wartime leader?
You see, my gut take, I can go through the specific ones. My gut take is that Trump is out for vengeance and is emboldened if he is president. Because look, he's been taking it on the chin in these trials, which the New York one for him is a personal humiliation, whether he's convicted or not. He is effectively sold to his followers that he is being demonized by the deep state. So I think Trump would hit the ground running on his first day. He's already made it clear he'd like to use the National Guard. If Trump won and you have a Republican House and Senate, there really will be very few, if any, checks on him. Your second scenario was
Tech.
totally over his head.
21st century space AI ID.
What is he specifically going to do?
How can he cope with that? I mean, when China is running away from us on green technology, on AI, on fintech, on all kinds of things, they're ahead getting.
I think it's totally over his head. He would be totally reliant on whoever, if he sticks, Steve Mnuchin is head of the Fed. I don't know. I mean.
Okay, and the last one was leadership in wartime.
Curt has given us the positive scenario that Trump backs out. I think that given the volatility of the international system right now, that throwing Trump in there is like putting an arsonist, giving a blowtorch to an arsonist. Because he will be intent on severing the ties to Asia and to Europe. And I think that will embolden Vladimir Putin. And I don't know that Trump would necessarily stand by Taiwan either. So in a sense, I suppose he could trigger more conflict abroad through a policy of restraint rather than activism. Curt.
Sure, cool. I'll just respond very quickly, sequentially. Look, my case is not that I think Trump's foreign policy is without any risks. I think there is risks in the American electorate selecting either of these gentlemen. This is an notably unpopular incumbent president. Incumbent presidents don't usually lose, especially when the party first takes it. This would be the first time since 1980 if Biden loses for the party to only have 4 years in the White House, obviously other than the Trump term. So we are in a reasonably extraordinary circumstance for us to even be having this conversation, for him to even be this high in the polls amidst the unprecedented political landscape at the moment. Louder, okay. I want to sort of address the subject of the idea that Trump is going to be bent on revenge and that is going to be the main thing he does. This is a guy who was a wheeler dealer for better part of 5 decades in New York. I think a lot of people have a lot of complaints about the way he did business. I think a lot of people have things to say about their personal interactions with him. The guy has ex-wives, ex-girlfriends, and it has not been a hallmark of his time and authority, either as a private citizen or as a public citizen, to really use force, either financial or political, against his enemies. There's been little things like the DOJ fighting Bolton on some book. We just haven't seen this stuff. And I understand it's the sexy argument, but there is this whole precedent of the first term and what he's actually done, and also his life experience as he reaches his 9th decade. To the questions specifically, woke. I think we had a nominee, potential nominee in the Republican Party that would have been more gung-ho to fight the cultural war issue, i.e. woke, and that was Governor DeSantis. Trump has specifically said that the woke messaging or the anti-woke messaging is a broken record. It's not selling. It didn't work that well in 2022. The Republicans won the popular vote, but they radically underperformed in the Senate and barely won the House, as we can see on Capitol Hill. As to the campus protests specifically, the country has had protests for the better part of 10 years now. And if anything, the issues have narrowed. This is a protest that is in smaller, far smaller than 2020. It is on effectively under 100 college campuses in any real way. And Trump has said that he thinks the Israelis should finish the war, implicitly, at least somewhat sympathizing with the plight of the protesters themselves. I don't think it's going to be this radical crackdown of anti-Israel protesters in GW. As to tech, I take your point that you think that the former president knows nothing about technology policy. I do think he is a clear nationalist and patriot and is not going to want to lose to the Chinese. And so I think there is something to the idea that Biden has, with his basically an industrial policy, has somewhat taken the baton from Trump. There's more consistency on this policy than there is difference. I expect Trump to build on that if he is reelected. And then finally, on Russia and China, look, I think the bar has just been set so unbelievably low. If Trump doesn't leave NATO, that is going to be shocking. So that strikes me as, for somebody who's cut 1 million deals and brags about his deal, deals are his art form, right, folks? Like that he will love that point of leverage to surprise in the other direction. And as to China, I think he has maintained more strategic ambiguity than the current president. The current president has said he would send U.S. troops to defend Taiwan. Trump has not committed to that, which I think was sage. Additionally, it's going to be hard to compare this term in office with the next one, whoever occupies it, because we are in a bit of an escalatory situation with Taiwan. They've just elected a DPP president who is more radical than his predecessor. Additionally, if we believe any of the intelligence assessments, the U.S. has concluded that President Xi has ordered his military to be ready by 2027. They can invade tomorrow, they can invade in 2040, but it looks like they're building to do something. And so the next president is going to have to grapple with it. And Trump has left more cards on the table for himself to play than the current president.
All right, so we have, oh wow, a lot. Okay, so over here and then over there, and then I have, I think 3 or 4 on this side. Yeah, I saw. Sir.
Johan Hassel, Senior Fellow at Center for American Progress. I want to turn the question a bit more to authoritarianism and democracy domestically in that sense. And I'm from Sweden, we have our own far right, and I find sort of like the similarities between what is happening in Europe and the US kind of fascinating. For you, Jacob, I wonder a bit, how do you see the resilience of the democratic foundations, and what do you expect from a Trump presidency regarding the governmental institutions, judiciary, civil society, democracy in that sort of sense? How do you think he will look at them? And if he goes, what do you see the resilience inside of them? Not talking about his circle of staffers, but at large, what is the resilience of US democracy at this time? And Curtis, how do you view Le Pen, Meloni, and Orban in Hungary? And what would you predict would be sort of like the consequences, outcomes, opportunities, challenges, problems if Trump is re-elected and you at the same time have Le Pen and Meloni and Orban in government in Europe? And how would you describe that kind of block and politics of this time?
And let's go for somewhat shorter answers this time, because we have several. Jacob.
So I will be brief. I do not expect much resistance to Mr. Trump at the federal level, should neither from the Supreme Court, which is already intervening on his behalf, nor from Congress, should the GOP control it, since Trump would be arriving in a sense as an imprimatur if he won re-election. From the states, however, it would be interesting to see. That's where you could start to see fissures in the American system itself. When you're looking at Pennsylvania, California, other Democratic-led states that might think that they had to resist encroachments from Washington.
Cool. All right. In order, Le Pen, so I believe that election will happen in 2027, so it wouldn't happen for quite a while into Trump's term. But I suppose in a scenario in which like Le Pen's party is overwhelmingly leading the polls, that would potentially make Macron veer right. I think Trump has a pretty good rapport with Macron. I think that's a pretty stable relationship. Meloni, I think she has revealed herself to be an utter pragmatist. I don't view that as a chaotic element in the slightest. And Orban, look, Hungary is Hungary. I think the shift will be that Trump's administration will not treat the president of Hungary like a toddler. Other than that, I wouldn't expect any larger commitment.
All right. We had down here. Yes.
What role do you see?
And if you could identify yourself.
Sorry, I'm Viola Ginger, Washington Senior Editor at Just Security. What role do each of you see in the patterns you're describing of misogyny? I don't see a difference between personal and the political. And I'm interested to hear your analysis of, Jacob, as you were researching this, what did you see any patterns over this historical trajectory that reflect issues of misogyny? And Curt, when you're talking about Trump or the broader issues related to him and perceptions of him, how do you see the role of misogyny playing out, if at all?
Well, the interesting thing about researching this book was originally I thought it was going to be all men, but it turned out that there are numerous female avatars of these retrograde doctrines, including I was talking about Elizabeth Dilling, I talked about Jean Kirkpatrick in the book. There are it was interesting in the late 1930s, there was a thing called the Mothers Movement that was virulently, that was funded by William Randolph Hearst. It had millions of members. And so I didn't really see misogyny as a theme here or search it out. What was interesting to me is that it's harder to argue that this is just a male movement.
Cool. Look, Republicans and conservatives have a women problem. If they don't win enough, especially of young women, they're not going to be elected. And if they don't convince enough to come on their side, they're not going to be able to wield power. Trump was inaugurated in late January 2017. You could argue his administration was immediately handicapped by the phenomenon of the Women's March. It made it very difficult for Trump to get a lot of his agenda through. That's a major problem. If Trump or his successors don't solve it, this is going to be fun to talk about, but they're not going to get much done.
Okay, and we had the three of you here, I think. I didn't see who was first. Let's go with you. And then,
James Hitfield,
yeah,
I'm a senior
and
fellow
Paul.
at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, and I'm a rehabilitated journalist.
You gotta talk louder, James.
Curt, you mentioned in your piece in the New York Times that you felt that the first Trump term was a template by which you could judge what his second term might look like. What do you say to the guardrail argument? Because a lot of people I talk to think the last 6 months of the Trump term is what the first 6 months of the next Trump term will look like. During that time, he wanted to put in the Insurrection Act. He wanted to have the National Guard shoot demonstrators in the Black Lives Matter protest. He put in people in the Pentagon and signed an order to pull all troops out of Afghanistan and Somalia within a couple of weeks before he was even out, after he had lost the election. Total chaos. And I'm curious why you think that that's not going to be more indicative, especially when you look at what Project 2025 and others are doing to prepare to get all of the guardrails away and put in, extreme Trump loyalists. Strikes me as I'm not filled with a lot of confidence that it's not going to look like the last 6 months of his term, but I'd be curious your thoughts.
We're sorry, not to question the questioner, but we're sort of weaving between domestic and foreign policy, so what would you prefer me to respond to?
Well, I'd like you to address both because they're both of a concern, right? He's the president. He has dominion over domestic and foreign policy. On both places, he showed some radical instincts in his last 6 months when the guardrails, i.e. the sort of more traditionalist establishment figures were disappearing from his administration.
Yeah, okay, well, I think we existed in a far different environment 4 years ago, unfortunately, and I would just submit. Okay, we existed in a far different environment 4 years ago, unfortunately, and I would just merely submit, in terms of the record, the demonstrated zeal to use state power to restrict citizens' rights was far more on the left than on the right. I lived under it. We all lived under it. That's the record. There are stories about, what if he would do the Insurrection Act or shoot people in front of St. John's the Church? None of that happened. Lockdowns did happen, and I just think that's the record. In terms of foreign policy, talking about leaving Afghanistan, well, we did leave Afghanistan. The intelligence assessment is that they would at least last 6 months. They didn't last 6 days. I don't see the difference between waiting for August 2021 and December 2020. We should have done it then. I'm glad we did it when we did.
Right. Okay, Paul. I'm Paul Pillar. I want to ask about how debates among the chattering class affects the thinking of the hoi polloi. And Jacob, I'd be interested in your observations about how the struggles for the soul of the Republican Party are playing out in the minds of Republican rank and file, neocons versus paleo conservatives and so on. But this is also relevant to Curt's opening comment when you said, Curt, that, well, if you accuse Trump of being a menace, we are a democracy, and we have a lot of people who want Trump back in power, which I might add is kind of a ironic way of putting it, given that the person we're talking about doesn't believe in respecting the results of democratic elections unless he wins. But I'm interested to look at, if you look at polling of attitudes toward Russia and Putin, among Republicans pre-Trump, it mostly reflected the Republican Party's traditional stance as being the party that stands tall against Moscow. And then once Trump really became the party, the numbers changed drastically. They didn't change much on the Democratic side at all. So I would suggest, and I want to get your comment on this, in addition to perhaps reflecting that there is an authoritarian streak, among the American public, a lot of this, you can't explain the change I just mentioned by referring only to that. Rather, it's more a matter of simple political tribalism, where the person who is head of their political tribe, who became Trump, is the one who is friendly to Putin, and so I'm going to express friendly views toward Putin as well. I cannot claim special expertise on the rank and file of the Republican Party. I did get a glimpse of this when I went on C-SPAN Washington and thought that the phone calls, the tribalism that you're talking about was in evidence. I was denounced by the conservative listeners as a liar and a deceiver. And, they're just unwilling. I said, listen to the evidence. You don't have to agree with my conclusions. And then on the other side, you have Democrats talking on the air about how they're going to attack the White House if Trump is reelected. So I do think, at least you get a sense of the polarization. I was in Pennsylvania recently as well. I don't think anyone's thinking about neoconservatives. It's too abstract. They're clearly, I get back to my sense that the neocons in some ways are responsible for this mess and have still not acknowledged their role in upending American politics in the Republican Party.
Agree with that. Hard agree. Neocons started it all. So, yeah. So in terms of the idea of democracy, look, obviously everybody has their opinions about what occurred in 2020. I've stated my views on it. Mr. Biden was elected the President of the United States, and it was a fair election. So as to the phenomenon of conservatives and Republicans, I think it is just interesting that Trump is this great threat to democracy, but you can just completely invert the argument that this is the only playing field in which the conservatives and Republicans are even competitive. Top universities in the United States, increasing the leadership of the military, Fortune 500 CEOs. Republicans are shut out of power everywhere other than the ballot box. In terms of Moscow, I do believe the Cold War is over, so it took a while for it to happen, but I'm glad that the Republican nominee and former president corrected Republican foreign policy. It took about 30 years, but it happened. And as to the idea that everything is structural and tribal, you're an accomplished gentleman. If you have a cynical view of human nature in that respect, I'm not going to persuade you otherwise.
Yeah. As the panel knows, there's a lot I could say about.
Identify yourself.
Yes, I'm Daniel McCarthy from Modern Age, which was a publication co-founded by Henry Regnery back in 1957. So, very rich topic here, lots that could be said, especially by those who are familiar with H.L. Mencken and Albert J. Nock and George Sylvester Viereck, which is a small confraternity perhaps, but a few members of that fraternity are here today. The general point I want to ask about, however, is, isn't this book simply saying that conservatives are conservative? And a few points to elaborate on that. After the French Revolution, you had a number of European conservatives, basically all of them, in fact, who were supportive of rather repressive regimes as a way to stop the outbreak of further French revolutionary sentiments. As you know, during the Cold War, you again have conservatives generally supporting authoritarian regimes, whether it's Franco or Pinochet, as a way of stopping the spread of communism. So that's one thing, that conservatives have a general tendency, which is, you could say it's pro-authoritarian, but it's actually anti-anarchistic, anti-communist, radical in general. And obviously there are hazards there in terms of overbalancing, but I think it's important to keep that flip side in mind, that it's not just a love of dictators, it's rather a desire to suppress revolutionary movements. Then the second point that has to be brought in as well, especially in this post-Cold War world, is anti-dictatorial rhetoric, as you, I think, at least alluded to, was used by neoconservatives during the George W. Bush administration, and in fact, it was also used by Clinton and Barack Obama as the rationale for getting the United States involved in a number of conflicts around the world. We got involved, of course, against the dictator Saddam Hussein in Iraq. There was a great push in this city to get us involved in a war with the dictator Assad in Syria. And it seems as if people who would like to get us into a number of conflicts all around the world continue to use as their main argument, well, we have to get into these conflicts in order to stop the spread of dictatorship and so forth. And so some of these, seemingly pro-dictatorship arguments are in fact anti-war arguments. They're arguments that say we don't have to get involved in every, human rights abuse all around the world. And in fact, when we do get involved, oftentimes, as in Iraq, we make a huge mess of things, which results in, hundreds of thousands of deaths. So those are sort of the 2 points I wanted to raise to both of the panelists today. First of all, isn't this simply conservatives being conservative and being anti-radical, which may, by just the logic of circumstances, make them pro-dictator? And when it comes to the post-Cold War environment, it is keeping us out of conflicts that are always styled by liberal interventionists and by neoconservatives as being anti-dictatorial causes we need to get involved in with force and violence.
Curt, let's go to Curt this time first.
Okay.
So,
Yeah, I mean, I think much has been made about how Trump is allegedly not a conservative, and I think to his credit, not a term that he leaps towards. That's probably why he's having greater resonance with the American people. I would say that it was a very important moment that was much maligned at the time, but when the unfortunate stuff happened in Charlottesville in 2017, he posited the question, where should we end the taking down of statues, right? And I don't want to litigate the differences between Confederate or other statues here, but he was pretty prescient about the desire to take down statues in this country was not based on a narrow interpretation of the Civil War. It was based on a broader iconoclastic tendency that's happening in the populace that he believes that we should fight back against, and I agree with it. And I think he is the representative of a tendency that is trying to conserve what this country has been about for most of its history compared to its rivals on the Democratic left. Additionally, you asked the question about interventionism, anti-war tendencies. I'm going to go back a little bit to the comments that Jacob made earlier about immigration restriction from 1924 to 1965, and also the tendency to keep us out of the world wars. You can make those arguments, but I think it is an equally provocative argument that was the interruption of the natural tendency. For most of American history, there was very limited federal state power and very limited power to wage war overseas. The idea that we should vaguely go back in that direction is treated as this unbelievably radical proposal.
Well, Curt is arguing that this is heresy, being treated as heresy. In fact, we should all be anti-war. Who is pro-war? And in World War I, there was a legitimate anti-war movement, as I tried to specify. The problem with these and I don't use the word conservative very often, because I refer to the right, because I don't think many of the figures that I talk about in this book are conservative. I think they tend to be more radical. And there is a difference between cold-hearted realpolitik and actual affinity or enthusiasm for a foreign dictator. And that's where the line got crossed with Hitler, Franco, Kaiser Wilhelm, and others. They're arguing that these countries are in fact superior to the American model. And that is what you hear today in many ways from the Heritage Foundation. And they are extolling Viktor Orban and the way he is remodeling Hungarian society in his own image and castigating race mixing. Now, that to me, again, crosses a line. As far, now the second, what was the second part of your question, Dan?
Well, that the anti-dictatorial rhetoric is used to get us into conflicts that we probably should stay out of.
There's no, I think that's spinning it a little bit. Because we're not talking, for example, in Ukraine, and I would be opposed to this. I do not believe that we should be sending American troops. We're just talking about aid to Ukraine. But that is being, much as Ronald Reagan aided the Contras in Nicaragua or other insurgencies around the globe, that does not require the insertion of American forces as you had under Obama when we attacked Libya, which turned into a disaster, or the second Iraq War. It's not necessary. I think that you can stand for American influence, power, and to some degree democracy in defending Ukraine, but you're not inserting American troops there. That for me is the distinction. I think the danger here, maybe the ultimate lesson, is that the lesson from the second Iraq War is being overdrawn. It doesn't mean that you just simply pull back and retreat unilaterally. Not every conflict is a new Iraq, just as not every conflict was a new Vietnam.
All right, we have one down here, I think. Yeah.
This is Sumatra from TAC, previously CFTNI.
You got to talk louder.
Do I have to talk loud? Sorry. I've got a couple of questions, very short ones, possibly could be given in a yes or no. One, you mentioned that no one wants to go to war. I agree. But wars don't start because of active action. In fact, in history, most of the wars are started by spiraling, the spiral model of conflict. Where do you see that stopping when it comes to driving aid or taking part in different conflicts across the globe? And second, connected to that, internationalism is good, great, agreed. But which theater do you think should America, under Trump, or in a future Republican administration, deprioritize because implosion and overstretch are two of the actors which leads to great power collapse?
Well, I'm
think
not convinced, for example, that there's this argument on the right from Bridge Colby that we should sever aid to Ukraine and focus on the potential threat of China. I see it the absolute reverse. I think China is a much more cautious power. I think it is to some extent, it is an adversary of the United States, but it is being demonized. And it is being treated as though it were the Soviet Union in its maximal expansionist phase. It's not. And it does not have an ideology the way that the Soviet Union did. Mr. Putin, by contrast, seems to be far more reckless, ambitious, and drunk on his imperial aspirations. Look at this coronation ceremony that just took place in Moscow. This is a little man with dreams of grandeur.
Do you want to say anything on that point, Curt, or let it go?
Yeah, I mean, I don't really see, this is my point about it. It's a great show, but which one is it? Is the neocons the root of all evil, or the lessons of Iraq overdrawn?
Sir.
William Schroeder, I'm with the Institute of World Politics, Naval War College. First of all, Mr. Heilbrunn, thank you very much for writing the book. I want to commend you for your previous comments about Russia. Russia has shown a propensity to use kinetic military force over the last 15 years. In the Donbass in 2008, again with in Georgia in 2008, in the Donbass in 2014, with the annexation of Crimea, supporting Assad in the Syrian civil war. They sent the carrier Kuznetsov from Murmansk all the way down through the Straits of Gibraltar into the Mediterranean. To do what? To support Assad. And now we have this invasion of Ukraine. So this is a seminal issue, I think, for American conservatives and the American right. If you don't get this right, you're going to be in the minority for a very, very long time. I thank God that the Senate, and I worked in the Senate for Ted Stevens for 5.5 years, got it right last month. It was the right thing to do. Just one other thing, it seems to me, and perhaps both of you can comment on this. Jacob, you said that Trump is not developing new arguments. And Mr. Mills, you said that there's an appetite for what Trump is selling. There certainly wasn't in 1980 when I came to this House an appetite for anything like this. 10% tariffs he wants to impose. His anti-immigration policies, Reagan would have totally opposed those, and Bush as well. So, and other issues, we could go on and on, so I'll stop. But you've talked about the neocons being something of responsible for this mess. Isn't it deeper than just the neocons?
Yes, I mean, I'm not trying to, I'm just trying to talk about something that I think is being ignored. Basically, I think, just to speak briefly, I think, and this perhaps gets back to something that Dan and Paul were talking about, there are two camps within the Republican Party. There is this tradition going back to Henry Stimson, Elihu Root, of Republican internationalism, still based in realism. It goes through Nixon, who served in World War II and was, in fact, an exponent. He supported a Marshall Plan. He believed in strong relations with Europe. This is not, it's not that the Republican Party has been out on the bungee cord for all of its history. There are these different factions vying for supremacy. And right now, the one that Curt thinks is hunky-dory has the upper hand. And that's what I think is problematic. I think it's useful as, in fact, I would argue that this faction is very similar to the neoconservatives in many ways. It's highly ideological, motivated, and possesses great certitude. However, it's useful as a critical function, but not in power.
Okay, look, I think respectfully, you and I part company on what we think is right and prudential. So I will just respond analytically to the points you made. The idea that Republicans are doomed to the minority if they take this as their ideological lodestar. I don't know. My entire adult life, I believe the candidate who espoused the less interventionist foreign policy won the presidential election. 2008, 2012, people made a sort of meme of saying, well, wasn't Romney right about the threat of Putin in 2012? Like, last I checked, Romney wasn't elected president. 2016.
George McGovern.
Okay, yeah, I understand. So you also made the point about 1980 on, and how the Republicans weren't talking about this. Respectfully, things have changed in this country in 40 years, and I believe the fact that the fact that the population has an appetite for something different implies that perhaps everything we did during that time period did not work.
All right. Okay. Anybody else?
Dan has
oh,
one last.
sorry,
Okay.
Dan, and I have a question for you guys too.
Yeah, let's,
Dan, please.
not to get too far into the weeds, but if we want to talk about something like Ukraine, for example, we might mention Ronald Reagan was often characterized during the 1980s as being pro-dictatorial, someone who was too soft on Latin American dictators, who were supporting right-wing counterinsurgency movements throughout Latin America and Africa. So your arguments at the time were used against Ronald Reagan. And I think perhaps now most people would say that those arguments were overblown. Now, Reagan does, of course, support the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. And this is something that's generally touted as a great success for American foreign policy and for Ronald Reagan's Cold War policy in particular. But, there is this kind of perverse question that arises. Might we actually have been better off if there had been a socialist regime in Afghanistan which had suppressed Islamic radicalism, rather than having this chain of outcomes that we had as a result of a success which at the time, all conservatives would have supported, but has had a certain amount of blowback. And as we look at things like Ukraine, are we certain we know what's going to be over the horizon as a result of our support or sending arms in the ad infinitum to Ukraine?
As long
Jacob,
as
go ahead.
those
We'll
arms,
give you the last.
as long as those arms are being closely monitored and the degree of corruption is being controlled, then you're okay. Otherwise, yes, you are taking a risk. And this was the big argument about Afghanistan, and Zbigniew Brzezinski was the main author, really under the Carter administration, of supporting the Mujahideen. And yes, you can instance it as a strong case of blowback. The issue was that the Soviet Union was actually a declining power, and conservatives misread the Russian invasion. It really was a half-baked defensive maneuver. It was not some thrust toward warm water ports. So, the Cold War, you can pull out a lot of sorry episodes.
Curt,
Look, I'm not going to top the inventiveness of the conservative argument in defense of allowing a socialist dictatorship in Afghanistan. But I would submit that the fact that it's so interesting and provocative is evidence enough that the fact that even elicited laughs or considerations here, that we should think more about what our actions are doing today for my children and the future of American citizens. Thank you.
I have just a vote into that.
In this very room, Jeff Kemp said, and I know because I saw it on YouTube, he said, you go with the proxy you have.
yeah, you go with the proxy you have.
It's there, you do it.
All right. You, one final, yeah.
I should have followed you. I was surprised to hear you make the analogy of saying that China is being demonized right now and as if it were another Soviet Union. And I just wonder, isn't there a risk that if we don't watch very, very closely, that we're going to miss the signs there just as we miss the signs, or we're overly optimistic about the early years of Putin?
No, because the Biden administration has strengthened American alliances in Asia. There's no lack of monitoring what China is doing. I'm not saying that they don't have aggressive intentions. I just think you don't want to create this World War I scenario where you have these self-fulfilling prophecies. And I don't think that the Chinese regime is pretty cautious. They're actually going to invade Taiwan. That's a big gamble. They've not been involved in a war since 1979 in Vietnam. They're not going to recklessly throw the dice.
And like 2 words, Hong Kong.
That was international agreements. I mean, yeah, they gobbled it up. It's a nasty regime. I'm not saying it's not, one that pursues draconian policies that, govern the monitoring system in China. It's bad. But is war inevitable as we're hearing here? Nonsense.
All right. Okay, we'll leave it there.
Thank
you, everyone. And thank you to both of you for that very energetic.